The moderator for this session will be Dr. Jane Ali Knight, who is the Director of Edinburgh Institute Festivals, Events and Tourism from the Edinburgh Napier University. Over to you, Jane.
Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. I think the lunch was obviously very successful because people are still networking. But I think we'll begin because we've got a really packed and interesting panel ahead of us. So the title for this panel is Positioning Cities as Vibrant Hubs for Events. And I think this is leading on from this morning's sessions where we were looking at how destinations can attract, bid and compete for events globally. So I think what we want to examine in the next hour is how cities can basically include events as part of their strategies and their brand, what reasons cities are already doing this. Also, I think an interesting point from this morning again is examining this shift from west to east in terms of where events are being bid for and delivered. And also the challenges and barriers that faces in terms of the future of global events. So I think we're very lucky that we've got a lot of expertise in the panel. We've got people from destinations as varied as Rotterdam, London, Edinburgh, Malaysia. So we've got a lot of expertise here that hopefully is going to be shared in terms of how these cities and destinations have used events to position them on a global scale. So before I hand over to the panel, obviously I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland. We claim to be the world's leading festival cities. We have 12 major festivals that happen, a lot of them in the summer months and also throughout the year. And the legacy and history of those going back to the 1940s. And a sort of an important fact really to start is that in recent research that was done in Edinburgh, it showed that basically 93% of people who were interviewed felt that festivals were what made Edinburgh special as a city, and also that 82% of people, the sole or one of the key reasons to visit Scotland was because of the festivals and events. So I think that's testimony to in terms of how important events can be in positioning cities. So I'd like to invite the first member of our panel, Johan. So Johan Merman is the Managing Director of Rotterdam Festivals, who are the organisation responsible for event and policy coordination in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So, Johan, how have festivals and events been used in Rotterdam to position the city?
Okay. Well, let's go back a few years. First, imagine a city with only one theatre, with only one museum. A city without a city centre. That was Rotterdam, my hometown, directly after the war. Destroyed. And the city tried to build up the city again. And they had a vision, but that was not about events, not even about culture or sports. That was about becoming a big port, becoming the biggest chemical complex in Europe, and rebuilding the houses for the people. And then it's interesting what happens, and it's also interesting to see what the role of events can be in a situation like that, because people want to meet, people want to celebrate, and people started to do their own events. So we became slowly but strongly a festival city because the people wanted to do that. Another interesting aspect is that a lot of these events were about things that were not only important for the people, but also for the city as a whole. There were 3 or 4 large events before the 1970s that were all about the rebuilding of the city, about how we can create a future together. And there was a close cooperation between artists, the community itself, the city government and the companies in the town, and they were all proud of what we have accomplished, celebrated that, but also at the same time formulated the future of the city. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of what festivals can do. Well, 50 years later, we are a very different city. We are the biggest port in Europe, but we're still a working class town. And we still had the image that if it was cultural, you shouldn't go to Rotterdam. And in 20, 30 years' time, that completely changed. We are now a vibrant city, a cultural city, a sports city. We have our stadiums, we have our concert halls. So events are not needed anymore to fill up the gaps. But so we have the palaces now, the cultural palaces, the sport palaces, but we still like to use the tents because they are dynamic, they are flexible, and they are more adventurous. So this whole tradition, you can say, as it grew out of the post-war period, is about people talking about their own city, celebrating their own city, and celebrating themselves. And that's still very important for us. Of course, we now use these events, and we try to position ourselves as a vibrant city as well. But we have to learn that. We do our large events. We were cultural capital. The only thing I want to say is cultural capitals can be very successful if they are there at the right moment in time. I'm a festival believer, but I don't think that festivals alone can change the world. Festivals can put a spotlight on things happening in the city, can maybe push it forward, but they won't change it alone. It has to be part of a bigger complex in which all kind of people are involved. The other one is, of course, we have the European Championships, we had the start of the Tour de France, we had the European Championship soccer, but we always surround it with side projects that include everybody in town. We don't want events that are only there for the people who can afford it or who flew in and leave the city the next day, or if it's football supporters on the same day. We like to involve all people. So it's always connected to our own people. And that's also the reason why the grassroots events are still important, and why all the neighborhoods events are also important. But again, from this, you see subjects rising that are important for the people, that are close to a DNA, that are important for the city as a whole. There's not much difference between that. So we have our cultural events, we have the sporting events, but we also celebrate our port. We have a festival around architecture, and we have, of course, we celebrate our cultural diversity. And all these festivals are growing in the direction of a spotlight on a theme with a lot of fun, with a lot of tourists, with a lot of people, but also interesting meeting points of ideas in which we formulate the future of our city again. And I think that's the key to success. Is it close to your city? Is it relevant for the people in your own city? And from there, you can find the right balance and grow to a tourist city. At least that is the way we go.
Okay, thank you, Johan. I think some key points there to park for later, for discussion. This idea of rebuilding the city through events, creating future, the close collaboration between the creative community and the government, and using events to bring a spotlight on cities, but also as part of a wider destination strategy. So we're now moving from Europe to Asia, and I'd like to introduce Tony Nagamaya, who's the General Manager for Malaysia Major Events. So Tony has just started a new division of the Malaysia Convention and Exhibition Bureau, so obviously in a very different place from somebody like Johan, working with Rotterdam Festivals. So obviously a new initiative to try and help lead Malaysia in terms of identifying and supporting international event bids. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you, thank you. Malaysia truly is an emerging country. I mean, we've been growing about 5 to 6% in our GDP for the last 5 years. There's been a constant growth in the country itself. The region as a whole has been growing progressively with a double-digit growth within the ASEAN region. Hence, Malaysia has been hosting many major events even before the formation of Malaysia major events. We had the Petronas Formula One, we had the MotoGP, we had the PGAs, we had the ATPs, we had the WTAs. All of these were handled individually by separate promoters. And what we felt that was lacking was a centralized agency which would be able to look at this entire major events as a national agenda. Hence, it became a statement from the Prime Minister during the National Key Economic Area, where it was a plan that he set for 10 years, where we wanted to move Malaysia from an emerging country to a developed country by 2020. And one of the key pillars was major events and business events as economic revenue to the country in terms of ROI, in terms of creating jobs, and in terms of elevating us into a developed country by 2020. So the last 3 years, we're basically a newly formed agency. We were formed the last 3 years. And the entire idea is to look at the entire Malaysian agenda, to look at the entire Malaysian plan, and to elevate Malaysia into the next level of maturity. Similarly to all the other agencies in the world, I mean, similarly to Events Denmark, Victoria Major Events, Events at Merton, we have the same objective. Our objective is to bring in as many tourists into the country or as many foreign spectators into the country for major events, as well as business events. We have hosted events on the business side, anywhere from between 600 to over 5,000-6,000 delegates. We have done the World Gas Conference, the World Accounting Congress, and so forth. And on the major events side, we also look at events which are very much niche, which caters to the Malaysian people and also to the region, because it attracts more tourists to the country. For example, events that we look at are very much youth events. We have recently just secured the largest sports extreme festival called FIS, Festival International Sports Extreme, for the next 3 years, which will be hosted in the UNESCO heritage site of the country called Malacca. So that's something that we do when we move events. We don't only concentrate on the main city of Kuala Lumpur, but we also move it around throughout the country. So the entire strategy was basically very much ROI driven, very much tourism driven, and hence we were parked under the Ministry of Tourism and Culture. It's become, for the last 3 years, I mean, Malaysia has been hitting about 28 million in tourists. And we started off with a KPI of 0.4% of the entire 28 million was actually people coming in for major events. By 2020, that objective has been set to about 1.2%. So we need to elevate the numbers in order to make that specific revenue to the country. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So I think this idea of using events to elevate countries from moving from being a developing to a mature destination, and the model that's been replicated in many destinations around the world of having a centralized agency to actually push that forward. So now we're going to move on to London 2012, and we've got our next two speakers have been directly involved with the delivery, particularly of the cultural programme within the London 2012 Games. So our first speaker is Nick Dodds, who's the Director of Festival and Events International. So Nick is a very experienced person on the festival circuit. He spent 10 years at the Edinburgh International Festival, then went to the Brighton Festival for 8 years, and has just completed working on the London 2012 Festival. So Nick, of all your experience of working in different destinations, what do festivals and events bring?
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, everybody. You've heard from a city and a country. You're now going to hear from a consultant who advises cities and countries and organisations about their festivals and events ambitions. My company, Festivals and Events International, works for governments and organisations, mainly on cultural events. We have some limited experience in sports and business events, but my main focus really is on cultural programs. And my clients, I find, come at events for a number of different reasons. I just want to highlight two this afternoon, and we've heard a bit about it, and that's to do with the economic side of events and why bringing a cultural event to your city, it makes sense in terms of visitors. And often my conversations with clients start where they say to me, well, we want to be the new Edinburgh Festival. How are you going to manage that for us? And I say, well, first of all, you need to get a great big pile of money, and then you need to get 65 years of experience of producing an event as good as this, and get the world's press to be interested in you, and then you stand a chance of replicating what Edinburgh has achieved over those years. It is probably the world's greatest cultural event, and it brings something like £250 million to the Scottish economy and attracts 4 million visits over that month, particularly of August. So it is a very big economic driver. But of course, Edinburgh had many other reasons for starting. It was really about cultural impact, not so much about economic impact, about learning and about social impacts of people coming together for the first time to celebrate together. So economic impact is absolutely the thing that I get asked about most from clients. But equally, I'm now beginning to see the subject of social impacts really coming to the fore, and what festivals can do to develop communities. I'm working in Bridgeport, Connecticut at the moment, a small city on the east coast of America, who have a 65-year-old event called the Barnum Festival, celebrating the life of P.T. Barnum, the great circus entrepreneur. And they've asked us to help them refocus their festival, to look at other aspects. Of course, driving visitors is important to them, but they also want to educate their community to become more entrepreneurial, to develop businesses. And by using Barnum, who was the great showman of the late 1800s, we're developing a festival with them that's really going to encourage people in that rather economically depressed city to think about how they can build themselves up as a community. So it's not all about economic impact. Two themes I want to just bring out for perhaps discussion later. We talked about this in our session earlier on. The difficulty that cities have in finding cultural events that they can bid for. Cities are very used to bidding for sports events, and if they've got a good bid and the right amount of money, they can usually win them. But there are so few cultural events that are peripatetic, if you like, that move around. Very often you've got to think about homegrown events, and what are the conditions that you need to create in your city to get successful homegrown events. That's theme number one. And the second theme, which I'll end on before handing over to Fran, is to do with the issue of sports events now wanting to involve cultural programs much more than they have done in the past. And Jane said that Fran and I were lucky enough to work on the London 2012 festival last year, the big finale of the Cultural Olympiad that London did so successfully. And it really was an initiative about marketing Great Britain PLC. There was no secret about that. This was about sending images around the world that showed Great Britain as an interesting place to come back to at another time. And we're seeing now in my world a lot more sporting events wanting to add cultural programs. For example, the Tour de France coming to Yorkshire this year for the Grand Départ, having a whole cultural festival attached to that, the start of that race. And I think that's a theme that we're going to see a lot more of. So those were just a couple of things I thought we could perhaps elaborate in discussion, and I think maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nick. We've also got a small event happening down the road from Edinburgh next year. We've got the Commonwealth Games coming to Glasgow in 2014, and as part of that we've also got a very strong cultural programme, and they've just actually launched Festival 2014, which is the cultural component of that. So I think that's a really interesting point going forward. So Fran Hegel is the Director of Cultural Inquiry for the Cultural Institute at King's College London. Fran has worked in culture and the arts for the past 16 years, and she joined LOCOG in 2005 and was responsible for delivering the framework for the cultural programme, which obviously led to the Cultural Olympiad and London 2012 Festival. The £126 million programme, which engaged over 43 million people over the course of 4 years. So, Fran, I think following on from a lot of what Nick said, what's been the key sort of lessons learned from that in terms of how to position London as an event destination?
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to talk a little bit about the space that arts and culture and sport and events come together in, as Nick trailed a little bit, and talk about how cities can really benefit from when those elements do come together and do work well. We heard this morning several people talk about the importance of understanding and realising legacy in relation to events for cities. And I'm very clear that given what our experience of London and indeed others, that arts and culture can play an enormous role in relation to legacy and helping cities and countries deliver that. But it doesn't happen automatically. There needs to be a lot of thought about how it happens, and it doesn't happen magically at the end. So as Nick said, I spent the last 7 years with London 2012 with him and others working on the cultural programme, and then the last year at King's College London reflecting on it, or recovering from it, or a bit of both perhaps. And the way that evolved was into something called a cultural inquiry, where we asked the question about really what role does arts and culture play in relation to major events, particularly major sporting events. We did a structured inquiry. We interviewed 2,000 people from around the United Kingdom, a representative sample. We interviewed 70 experts who have run arts and cultural programs, major sporting events, big events all around the country and the world, in fact. And we did a detailed review of the literature to see what evidence there was out there, above and beyond a belief that arts and culture in this context is a good thing. So our findings, which were released in the last kind of 10 days or so, were really very clear and unequivocal, really, about the fact that arts and culture do add value to major events, particularly sporting events. And they add value in a number of ways. They add it to the civic and public realm. It develops and it enhances local pride, community engagement, well-being. It enables people to come together, particularly when the communities have a route into the celebrations. We know that when a major event comes to town, it's hugely unlikely that the local population are all going to have a ticket to attend that event. So there needs to be a way of engaging with the local community, the local population, and arts and culture is a great way of doing that. It also contributes and adds value in the realm of operational effectiveness. Something like spectator experience. It can help you move your crowds to and from events. It helps give the media something to talk about. It can help with sports presentation. So there are real hard reasons for doing this too. And it also adds value in terms of all the different stakeholders involved. For the city itself, it adds to the city reputation, the city CV. It puts the city on a global platform. Of course, the sporting event's going to do it, and I'm sure that will happen absolutely brilliantly. But people want a little depth, they want a little culture, they want a little colour, and the arts and cultural programme that can accompany an event does that like nothing else. It works for event organisers. I've said it helps with operational effectiveness, or it can do. It can also enhance your reach. We, believe it or not, in the course of our inquiry said we found evidence of people having bought tickets to the sport because of the culture. And I'm sure there are some people here that will raise an eyebrow at that, but nevertheless, it can extend the reach. It can certainly offer a more family-friendly proposition for an event if there's something else or something for the whole family to do and go and see. It offers value for the spectators because they get a more rounded experience. It gives us a sense of the local place where it's happening. We talked in a breakout session earlier that sporting events can look very, very similar from city to city to city, whether it's the Formula One taking place throughout the season, or whether it's the Olympic Games, or whether it's the tennis. Everybody knows what a tennis match looks like, and often your players are the same, but it's actually the local culture that adds that distinctiveness and differentiates it. And it also adds value for sponsors. Sponsors have another means through which to activate their sponsorship, and it provides means of opening up new markets, local markets, and of course staff engagement as well. So there is a lot of value to be gained from entering this realm of sports and arts and culture. But it's not terribly easy all the time. We were fortunate in London that eventually we made it work, but I think we have to acknowledge that it isn't necessarily the job, first and foremost, of an event organiser to worry about delivering legacy outcomes or an arts and culture programme. Their job is to put on the event, and they have to do it well. So we need to find a way of connecting event delivery organisers and the arts and cultural world. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here when I say it's not always easy to do that. They're often very, very different kinds of people that work in those two disciplines and those two industries. And so another finding we had was that although the outcomes that everybody's wanting to achieve may be similar, the means by which you do it need a lot of thought and a lot of understanding and a lot of work, because people tend to speak different languages, they have different approaches, they work on different timescales, they're funded in different ways, and they're administered differently. So trying to find common ground can be a challenge, and it's something that needs to be worked at. However, people and the general public would like to see arts and culture programmed as a routine part of major sporting events. Our polling said that 62% of the UK population thought this was a brilliant idea and they want to see more of it. So therefore I think the onus is on us as industries to work out how we do that better. Something else to come out was the idea, and again this came up in the breakout session and earlier this morning, that the nature of the major event industry, where an organisation is set up temporarily and experts are parachuted into a city to deliver it and then go away again, isn't necessarily the optimum arrangement if you want to deliver legacy for a city. So there is perhaps room to think for, if you're a host city, about the structures that are put in place to ensure that your local staff, the local people who are working in the city, are able to benefit from some of that world expertise that comes into the city, but it doesn't then just disappear again. And then finally, there is a real momentum building, certainly in London and parts of the UK, to really understand this world better. As Nick said, we are seeing more and more of it happening. It's starting to become understood that when you have a sporting event, you might want a wider offering, a fringe offering, a cultural offering. And so we're proposing that over the next 3 to 5 years, we use some of the major events that are coming along in the UK, whether they're the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, the commemoration of the First World War, the Rugby World Cup in 2015, or the Athletics in 2017, to look at how we might test this model, expand this model, and learn how we can do it better.
Okay, thank you, Fran. So again, I think some key learnings there from London in terms of economic, cultural and social impacts, this idea of legacy and momentum building post-event, the challenge of parachuting events into destinations, and also the importance of events being distinctive and differentiating the locality that they're actually based in. So now we're going to move to Paris and to Eric, who's the Assistant Director General for External Relations and Public Information at UNESCO. And Eric oversees the work of the organisation in the political field with member states, and also coordinates activities geared towards civil society. And obviously, as part of his role, UNESCO deliver events all over the world. They've recently had a World Heritage Conference here in the region in Doha. So obviously a slightly different remit in terms of maybe looking at multi-destinations, and also using events to reinforce the UNESCO brand. So over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Jane. A different remit indeed, but I think very complementary to what the previous speakers have said. First of all, it could be perhaps useful to remind everyone that as an intergovernmental institution, we benefit from a membership of 195 member states, and we do organize events all over the world. We are responsible for the promotion of peace and dialogue amongst peoples and nations, and we operate in various fields. The field of culture, obviously, that's the C of UNESCO, but also in the field of social, human, and natural sciences, that's the S, and of course, I should not forget the E of education. So the first message perhaps that I would have today for you is that any one of our member states really has an equal chance to be able to host one of our events. It's really part of our mandate, and in fact, part of our DNA to ensure that all regions of the world, all countries, all cities are put on an equal footing when we select venues and conferences. So everyone has a chance, and I think it's important when we talk today about the theme of emerging cities, where perhaps some are a little more shy about staging events than others. Dubai is clearly paving the way in the Middle East with Expo 2020 when it comes to mega events, but we've had an opportunity to work here in Dubai with literally dozens of events organized here over the years. And what we bring perhaps that's different from these mega events like the Expo is, if I use two words, substance and hopefully also prestige. In the region, I should mention, Jane, like you just did, that neighboring Doha will be the host city for the World Heritage Committee. That's the committee that chooses the new sites that are included in the World Heritage list of UNESCO that I'm sure is very familiar to many of you. There will be thousands of government delegates, but also civil society representatives and experts who will converge onto Dakar. This week, the city of Baku, Azerbaijan, is hosting another one of our important committees for the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. There again, that's thousands of delegates who are coming to a city for the first time. Many international visitors who are coming for the first time only because of this conference. So I think you see the advantages that hosting such a conference can have. We have a wealth of different possibilities related to our mandate. This year in 2013, we were able to attract some light onto Istanbul, which was chosen as the city where we celebrated International Jazz Day, which is a new UNESCO celebration. We've also been able to celebrate World Press Freedom in San Jose, Costa Rica, which for the day became the capital of press freedom. One of the initiatives that I would like to highlight also is our Creative Cities Network. As we all know, cities are becoming increasingly dominant actors in socio-economic and cultural development, and at UNESCO we certainly know that the creative economy is a highly transformative one in terms of income generation, job creation, and export earnings. So with us, cities can become labeled officially creative cities in 7 fields, from literature to music media arts, design, film, and more. And at present, we have 41 member cities in our network, and it is growing. Your own city of Edinburgh is recognized as a UNESCO City of Literature, and I think that it has helped Edinburgh market itself in this particular field to a large extent. So these are just a few examples to demonstrate the ability of UNESCO to engage with cities, not just with governments and member states. And I hope I have piqued your interest, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards so that perhaps some of you here in the room can become host cities for and with UNESCO.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And I think 3 more words to add to our list: substance, prestige, and engagement. So now to our final speaker, Bob Palmer. So Bob is a consultant and former director of culture and cultural and natural heritage for the Council of Europe. So Bob works on lots of international projects dealing with events and festivals, particularly in cultural planning and policy, and he's worked on many European Capital of Culture bids and also delivery platforms. And he's also written some very interesting books on eventful cities. So Bob, what's your viewpoint to add in terms of what events and festivals bring to destinations?
Thanks, Jane, and I'm aware that I'm the last speaker, so I want to speak about one point, and just make one point about cities. And this point is that I think there is a major distinction between a city that hosts events, I'll call it a kind of good hosting city, and a city that I call an eventful city. And I think cities really have a choice about which category they want to be in. My thesis is that in terms of making real, sustainable, long-lasting legacies and having huge impact on cities, I think there are major limitations in simply being a hosting city. That is, a city that is a kind of robust container for events, or a city which fosters the attraction of events, as opposed to a city where events are fully integrated into the wider experience of the city. There's a huge distinction between these two specific terms. I've worked on events, as Jane said, in many, many different places, and I've come across the majority of cities that perhaps are very good hosting cities, but very few cities that can really promote themselves as eventful cities. And I just want to make the distinction to be very, very clear what I mean. And that successful eventful cities are cities that have moved from a preoccupation with attracting innovative events, perhaps on a monumental scale, perhaps with iconographic appeal. They've moved from that position and shifted mainly to events which are making a more kind of integrated, holistic contribution to the city as a whole. Because I think events and event consumers and cities are moving from what has been called the event economy to something which is now more closely allied to the experience economy that involves events. I really need to make a distinction between these two different elements. What I'm seeing globally in many cities is perhaps an oversupply of events and increased competition for attracting events, and there appears to be an increase in the consumer's search for real experiences. The search for real experiences as opposed to event products. And there's many reasons for this, this particular shift. But retaining this distinction between a good hosting city and a strong eventful city, both of these categories, of course, require very strong technical venue and event infrastructures. Both require strong partnerships between governmental and non-governmental and business partners. Both need effective branding and marketing strategies. Both rely on tourism infrastructure and media coverage. But an eventful city, in addition to all of that, will have developed the means of a kind of a successful leverage, a leverage of what I call its community capital, its real involvement of the local community by involving very diverse elements of the city's local inhabitants. An eventful city transforms each and every event into a kind of celebration, not of the event itself, but for the city as a whole. And an eventful city is primarily preoccupied with legacy. Mainly the legacy of knowledge gained, the legacy of maintaining spirit, the legacy of creative innovation. These are all intangible legacies. Hosting cities perhaps focus more on the more practical and concrete legacies, how to utilize venues that have been built or refurbished, how to maintain and develop more sophisticated transportation systems. But the eventful city perhaps concentrates more on the intangible, the indigenous, rather than the razzmatazz of a monumental event. So sustainable eventfulness is not so preoccupied with frivolity and consumption, but a complementarity between the old and the new, a seamless integration between the experience of an event and the experience of a broader context of the city as a whole.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So I think, yes, this idea of distinction between a city who hosts events and an eventful city. So we've got some great food for thought there, some really interesting perceptive observations. So now it's your turn. So who would like to pose the first question? Any questions from the audience? Yes, the front here, I think. No? Scratching your head? Sorry, here.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I want to ask Johan, when you organize Rotterdam Festival, how much money does it come from government grant? And how much money do you receive from, say, sponsorship and private sector? And if you couldn't find enough money, how do you cope with that? Thank you.
Okay,
Yep.
so issues around funding.
Yeah, I have to explain a little bit about our model in Rotterdam. First of all, we have a great organization for the sports events. We don't do that, we do the rest. And the other one is that we are supported with government money, and we support festival organizers and try to help them. So if you look overall at all the events in the city of Rotterdam, approximately 25% of the money comes from the city of Rotterdam. And 75% comes from commercial income, sponsorship and box office.
In Malaysia, What's your model that you use there?
From the government, as a government agency, we have certain funds that has been given to us on a yearly basis for the next 10 years by the Ministry of Finance to fund and to incentivize events that come into the country, as well as to build local events. And how we work is we have a model that's been built by PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, and that model looks at two things. One is ROI and one is the social impact that it brings into the country. A number of tourist days, a number of tourist stays, how many tourists international, how much of them are local, and it evaluates and gives us an amount. But we do not underwrite an event 100%. We work very closely with the local partners or local sponsors in the country itself. What we do is we usually take up somewhere between 30% if it's an exclusive event to the country. If the festival is exclusive and it's only in Malaysia, it doesn't go around the region, we take up about 30%. No, if it's exclusive, we take up 50%. If it's non-exclusive, we take up 30% of the entire cost of the event.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question for the panel, actually. Does every city need a vibrant events industry to succeed? Any thoughts?
We like to believe that. No, I think of course, I think people like events, and I think a lot of changes in the cultural world are speeded up by events and not by the bigger institutions, so that's great. So it adds something to the vibrancy of a city. But I think the tradition shows that it's the most interesting festival cities are often cities that have something to gain, that have something to win, that come from far. So it helps if you want to develop as a city.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just to answer the question, because you asked it in two parts. I think every city needs events. Events really help develop its identity, and events create or help to create a larger social capital and community involvement. What I don't think every city needs, of course, is an events industry. I think that is a different component. And I think sometimes cities merge the two. That is, a city which is very successful in terms of staging events may not have a critical mass of what we would call kind of industrial of people involved in it. It doesn't have to be a major employment factor. The objective doesn't have to be the attraction of a large number of visitors. I think basically it's a decision of what vision a city wants to subscribe to.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, at the back here.
Hello, it's Andrew Smith from the University of Westminster. Apologies for sounding a bit sceptical, negative, but we've heard a lot about the positive aspects of positioning a city as an event city, but there must be some problems and issues and negative aspects too. So I wonder if the panel could tell us or warn us about the potential pitfalls of positioning a city as an events capital.
Great question. What are some of the challenges and pitfalls?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I would say about that, we've touched on it in this session and previously, is involving the citizens of the city in the events. They can often seem like events parachuted in that don't have any resonance with the people who live there. The most successful events that I've been involved with and have seen and advised on are ones that are built up from the ground, if you like, where people really want the thing to happen. But I have seen cities where they've made that mistake, and there's been a resentment. And indeed, we've seen it in parts of the world, and it was referred to in this morning's session, where the populace are actually taking against events because they don't think it's the right priority for the city.
Johan?
Yeah, another one is that I think that because the festival world is fragmented, has a lot of small organizers, that the full potential of the events is not recognized by everybody. I think I'm a festival believer. I think that festival can mean so much for society, for cities, both for the promotion as for the social development. I even believe that in the future, Festivals will be part of clusters of industries where they can show products and also discuss the future of a certain subject. And still, probably by people look at us or how we behave ourselves, many people think that it's a party of a weekend and then we go over to the normal world again. So I think there's a lot of gain in terms of potential for cities.
Eric, have you seen any challenges within any of your member states in terms of reluctance maybe to engage with events?
Necessarily, I mean, there's some challenges. I think we're talking a little bit about World Heritage Sites, for instance. We alluded to it in the context of hosting a committee that decides on World Heritage Sites, but one should also point out that there's a lot of cities that are partly or altogether a World Heritage Site. And we do see both advantages and problems with it. As soon as a city, for instance, if it is a city, becomes inscribed on the list, we see a huge jump in tourism, which has been measured in some cases up to 20% over the course of 1 year. If a country is not prepared to receive these international visitors, it can cause actually a lot of damage to these places, which often are historical places, places of significance in a variety of ways. I think it's maybe steering the discussion a little bit away from the mainstream, but I certainly can mention that aspect as an important one.
Okay. I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions. One here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jeff Lippman. I'm from an organisation called the International Coalition of Tourism Partners. And I just want to come in on this, the last point, actually the point raised by the first speaker. We believe that festivals are going to become one of the most important components of what I'll call the tourism and city and even country mix in the future, because they are actually a place where you can bring the domestic market together, which is often so important when the economic situation turns down. It's a place where you can get the local communities involved, and it's a place where you can link the international with the domestic. So I'm convinced of what you said. But I think on what Eric said, and this is really important, there's a huge sustainability dimension. It's not just with World Heritage Sites, it's when you start to bring a lot of people into the cities. Most of this activity is driven by the promotional side, and frankly, that's what also comes with big events and host city activity. And everybody talks about the sustainability dimension, but then deals with it when it's too late. So I think it's a very important point on the role of festivals in all of this.
Okay, so obviously in terms of sustainability, you know, how can we develop vibrant events, destinations that are also truly sustainable at every level? Is it possible?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. I think given, certainly from the UK's perspective, where we've been over the last few years, we're seeing an enormous growth in the appetite for people to engage in festivals and cities to have festivals. And so I think somebody was speaking about this earlier. We need to share our experiences much, much more. One of the things that we are looking to see if we can do is to set up a kind of consortium, a kind of body, a kind of sharing network where festivals and organisations can come together to share what works and what doesn't work, actually, much more importantly, about promoting an event, about promoting a festival, about getting the balance right between getting people excited and then delivering on actually the reality and the legacy afterwards. There's an awful lot of consistency and learning that can be taken from event and festival to festival, and it would be great if we had one resource that brought all of that together.
I just want to concentrate just for a moment on this question of balance, because all cities talk about this. I mean, the balance between international events and the local context. But what I discover very often is this is simply rhetorical. Cities say this, but when you actually look at their preoccupation, the preoccupations are for the building of a cultural infrastructure and dealing with the bigger physical issues. and the rest is sort of left in a very non-strategic and unintegrated manner. And I think cities that really want to build this connection with locality. Locality is incredibly important in terms of the experience that a consumer of events have. And I think it's very local. I don't think it's national. I think sometimes, too, there's a confusion between big events that are trying to reinforce a national identity, but the local context is something very, very different. But this requires strategy, it requires action, it requires a different style of partnerships, it requires a whole new set of stakeholders. So I think there's a lot involved in actually making real this sentiment of balancing these two components.
Okay, thank you. Nick?
Yeah, can I just come back on Fran's point about fora for sharing experiences? I'm not so familiar about the right forum for cities to get together to discuss these things, apart from conferences like this. But certainly for the festival and event producers, there are a whole broad network of fantastic trade associations that are around the world. And I would encourage any producers in the room who aren't involved with some of them, either in your own countries or in your own regions, to look at those, because that's where festival producers get together and really share this knowledge. And I'll save Johan's blushes about the IFEA, the International Festivals and Events Association, which has chapters all over the world, but I'd really encourage you to look at that as a good network for sharing information.
Okay, Eric?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to come in on the sustainability question because it's very, very important. And I'll speak not so much from my current UNESCO perspective, but my years at the UN Environment Programme and involvement with the preparation of Olympic Games and FIFA World Cups and so on. And the simple answer, I think, to the question is really that you cannot be a host city and expect to have major events organized in your city if you do not have a proper sustainability team incorporated into the planning committee with real experts, particularly in the environmental field. I think all of the mega events organizers now have incorporated that dimension, and it needs to be a part also of at least the cities with the greatest ambitions. It cannot be otherwise if you want to be considered seriously today.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So before we finish, I'd just like to maybe, in the idea of sharing experiences, maybe just invite the panel just to maybe offer to Dubai, obviously as they go on this journey in the next 7 years towards the Expo, and also further developing the destination as a vibrant hub for events, which we've heard about a lot this morning. So what sort of one experience you'd like to share with Dubai in terms of something that can help them in that positioning journey? Johan.
Okay.
If you run out by the time you get there.
Well, it's one of the possibilities. But I think we have a very successful focus on architecture project and use our architecture in our music festivals, in other festivals. We do rooftop concerts, we do all kinds, and people love it, and they get a better view of the city, and they get a new view of the city. So I think I would like to do an architecture festival in Dubai.
Good. So using the architecture?
Yeah.
And I'm sure Dubai, they know what they're doing. And, it's something way above my league. I think Malaysia is not even close of thinking of winning a bid as big as that. But I'm sure they'll do a good job.
Okay, thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I would echo that. Of course, Dubai is already a hugely successful city for this sort of activity. But I would say one of the themes that came out of our conversation earlier on is the need for authenticity and to think about growing events that are authentic to the city and to the region. That's what people travel for, to find out about. They can go anywhere to see this event or that event that looks the same. What they come for, I find, is something that really is authentic of the place.
Okay, thank you. Fran?
My sharing would be to think about the morning after. So we all know how to put on a great party, but actually what's important is what happens afterwards. And it sounds to me from the discussions this morning that Dubai is pretty sorted on this, but perhaps other people can learn from this, which is after the event, how do people who were left behind, who are still here, what's changed for them and how are they better off for it?
Brilliant, thank you. Eric?
Dubai is doing wonderfully well and does not really need advice from anyone, but since UNESCO has two priorities, priority Africa and priority gender, I would have to say that more care and attention needs to be given to the gender balance at events.
Okay, good. And finally, Bob?
Yeah, Dubai is without any doubt a leader in world events. It has potential, but I think Dubai thinks always big. It's always mega. And my advice would be sometimes to think of the micro, of the small, of the interconnections, of building a social capital on the basis of many, many, many small initiatives which may not be as visible to the rest of the world, but incredibly important in terms of the city's own cultural development.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like you to all join me in thanking our panel for some great insightful comments.